And as we move on to the next slide here, so after the closing of the gold window by Nixon, basically we're seeing a lot of things kind of coalesce around 1971. Most who have lived, are older than 50 years old will remember the 1970s is a very bad decade. Stagflation, unemployment, lots of different things came to a head in 1970, 1971. This will be, if we go back a few slides where I was telling you exports versus imports for the United States, we used to be, by far, export much more than we imported. By this point, we are now actually importing more than we are exporting. For the first time, we've become an importer nation. What starts this whole cascading problem is, remember, the whole system is based upon gold. The U.S. dollar is not seen as such a good bet by 1970. Countries are starting to really, look at the debt accumulation of the United States, our growing military. Some countries decide that maybe it's, the U.S. dollar is not such a good bet. The panic is started by France, who had accumulated quite a few U.S. dollars, deciding that they wanted gold. They didn't want to recycle their dollars back in to the United States in the hope that the currency is going to appreciate. This causes a huge panic at the time, which leads us to the collapse of Bretton Woods and the start of the floating currency system. After 1971, there's a real fear that, like prior to the Great Depression, the collapse of international trade is a real possibility at this point. The people, the heads of state at that time, and the financial ministers of the time, and the central banks of this time period, all meet back again in Bretton Woods. They hammer out a system, and I think, to be honest, it was very hastily constructed. They were under a lot of pressure. Things, at the time, were really going south quickly. So what they come up with is a system where the U.S. dollar is still the centerpiece of international trade, but basically the link to gold is severed. But the problem becomes is that, without an appreciating U.S. dollar, what's the benefit to the rest of the world? Why would they sign on to this? And then basically this goes to interest rates. Before it was about 4.5% that we were paying on U.S. debt. Throughout the 1970s, you start to see year after year, the U.S. Fed using its, if we're going back to my debt credit video, you have to go back and understand how interest rates work, but basically the Fed kept raising interest rates. This made U.S. debt more attractive. We started the 1970s at about 4.5% interest on our debt. By the end of the decade, into 1981, it was close to 20%. So you can see that this is how, why the United States, throughout the 1970s was punished pretty harshly for our short-sightedness. But what we gained out of the 1970s was an acceptance of the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar system did not end in the 1970s, only the gold standard upon which it rests. By 1981, we had gone through the worst of the 1970s, but the U.S. dollar system was still intact, and this is crucial to understand, what happened from 1980 to present, which leads me to my next slide here. I'm going to hit on this chart real quick before we move on to the 1980s. Basically, what this chart is showing is the makeup of debt and who is buying it. If you go back far enough, maybe back to the 1940s, people in the United States would buy U.S. debt. You could go out and buy treasury bonds, or you could buy, all sorts of vehicles to buy U.S. debt. This chart only goes to 1997, but if you can see the trend is pretty clear. The blue signifies foreign holding of debt. If you were to keep following this back to 1980 into the 1970s, the amount is smaller and it grows larger every year. Basically, we're covering our budget deficits by, having foreigners buy our debt. So I just thought this would be interesting to show how our debt is broke down. So basically, we get to the 1980s, Morning in America, and the era of deficits don't matter. By the beginning of the 1980s, this new floating currency system, people start to trust it. And I think throughout the 70s, it was a feeling out process. How is this going to work? And there was a real fear that the whole thing might collapse again. By the beginning of the 1980s, there's a faith that the system might actually work. So you get to the era of deficits don't matter. This is basically a chart showing U.S. debt, U.S. indebtedness. As you can see, we're starting in 1963, and this really only goes to 1999, or the year 2000. If I could continue this, I think it'd break through the top of the TV set here. This is showing $4 trillion. This is 1999, 2000. 2013, we're on track to hit $14 trillion. So this is for another 10 trillion. So I put the line somewhere up about here. So we started on an era of deficits don't matter in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan, budget deficits through the moon. We're talking $480 billion of overspending per year. Building out our military, massive giveaway programs throughout the 1980s. I know Reagan isn't attributed to being a huge person who increased welfare spending, but the numbers don't pan out that way. The amount of money being spent on the military and Social Security and all these things are exploding throughout the 1980s, but basically, so long as we keep offering up interest rates that are attractive to countries and they keep buying it, they have a vested interest in making sure that the system goes because they have U.S. Nobody wants to see the system end. So basically, where I'm going with here is, why does the world go along with this system? They have to see that the United States, year after year, keeps spending more and more, and they're holding on to more and more of our debt. Simple answer is oil. The whole system is based around commodities, and oil being the most important one. Another major event that happened in 1971 is the point where U.S. oil production crossed U.S. oil demand. Following 1971, the United States consumed 100% of what it produced, and then some. And then that only got worse throughout the 1970s. Year after year, production continued to decline in the United States, even as places like Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico came online. Production continued to go down, demand continued to go up. So basically, on this side of this chart over here shows U.S. total production peaked at about 10 million and has continually gone down ever since. If you were to look at demand or oil consumption, the United States at this point is consuming 100% of it. Our demand line just continues to go up throughout the 1970s, 80s, and into the present, while this number continues to head down. It leads me to a concept known as petrodollar recycling in our money system. I'm just going to move right on to crude oil prices here. A lot of the stuff, it's interconnected, and it's hard to make the connection sometimes. But as you can see, the price of oil, during the era of the United States being, the biggest producer in the world, stays static, even drifting downward. Again, you can see right here, 1971, a huge spike in oil prices. This is the collapse of Bretton Woods. This is the collapse of the international system. OPEC, Saudi Arabia, the oil-producing nations decide at this point that they're no longer willing to just take the U.S. dollars, so they start demanding more U.S. dollars for their oil. Prices spike, throughout, and basically hit their peak right around the time of Reagan. Basically, one of the things that Reagan did through diplomacy and some strong art and tactics was to get Saudi Arabia on board with the United States to rein in OPEC.